Kelly, thank you so much for joining the show today. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, Kelly, I wanted to get started by just getting to know you a bit. I was looking over your LinkedIn profile and saw that you had some great experience in a number of companies, specifically a couple that I wanted to ask you about. Um, the public speaker and talent innovator with Build HR, right?
Yeah, so that's actually my company. I don't really like the title of founder, so to speak, because a lot of people, when you are an entrepreneur and you're starting out, some people may or may not look fondly on that. And I don't feel like that's really what I did. What I do is truly innovate how companies work with their people. And it's also a conversation starter. So I tend to say like I'm more of that talent innovator versus just a founder. But that's my company that I've done for the last 10 years. And it's kind of led into public speaking in regards to different types of conferences and events. And it's been a very big learning journey, but a lot of fun.
Hmm. Oh, no kidding. Yeah, I didn't even realize. I didn't read carefully how long you've been doing it. So, as an entrepreneur, saying, it's definitely a journey for sure. So, let's talk about that a bit. Like, was it easy? Was it okay? I started and all of a sudden I'm speaking and have my dream fulfilled or what?
Absolutely not. No, not at all. So I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. So I did see that kind of path laid out. Me going into that, it really was out of a necessity versus a kind of handed to you scenario. So I did get the opportunity when my contract, while I was with a major Fortune 500 company, was coming to an end. I actually spoke at a local event specifically around recruiting. And that company owner approached me and said, I need actually help in this area. Would you be willing to work with us? But we can't hire full time. And so I was already coming off an opportunity and I kind of needed to find something, but then this opportunity kind of presented myself. So it's out of necessity as well as of like that kind of meshing. But it definitely has been a bumpy road of ups and downs. I do facilitate some of my time with a full-time job because it is very ups and downs. But it's not just the employment piece, right? Like there's a lot that is involved on the other half of who you are as a human being,
Mm-hmm.
which is that mental health and as well as just that personal life, right? You're not your job. And so it's one of those things where it's bumpy on both sides. But I definitely think it has led to the public speaking. I've always wanted to do that. It's a lot of fun to just kind of share, but it's has slowly evolved just based on the different skill sets and expertise I've been able to gain over the course of my different types of consultancies that I've been able to do with different businesses. And so it has evolved into that based on experiences, but it's been a bumpy, long story short, it's been a bumpy road nonetheless.
That's okay. So thank you for sharing. Now, I bet you have some awesome stories. And before we get into that, we're going to get real for a sec. Because 10 years later, we can look at your experience and say, hey, here's what you've learned, how you've grown, the cool stories that you have, and awesome. That's generally the side of the story that most people hear. And then they say, oh, well, she's just, successful. And that's great. But there's the story behind it that most people don't see. And then when others are on that journey, then they can say, well, I'm not there yet. And now I'm discouraged and yada, yada. So let's start with that side of the story, and then we'll get into your awesome success stories, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've learned during this journey is I actually have been diagnosed with depression and anxiety. And that's not something that I knew when I was younger. And it made a lot of sense once I had that diagnosis. But that came from a very volatile situation in my life where I was actually in an abusive relationship, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. And that lasted for a while. And that really breaks you down to a level that you don't even think you're human, right? And I experienced that in some of my consulting clientele as well, a very abusive, toxic relationship. And luckily, I was able to separate from those as well as my personal scenario. But it was then that I decided to go see somebody about it. And it took a lot, it wasn't easy. It took a lot of courage. And I'm proud of myself for that, to finally talk to somebody about it. But that's when I got that diagnosis. And at the time, they were like, for somebody your age, it's a pretty strong diagnosis because of the indicator levels, right? And that's okay, right? We all have those different moments. But it was during that time that I realized that it's not just me being down on myself, that there's literally something behind it, such as a chemical imbalance or a hormonal imbalance or whatever that may insinuate for that individual within that diagnosis. For me, it was a combination of the two, of hormonal and chemical, and having help to go through that and to heal through that with, a therapist as well, really facilitated the rest of myself coming together. And don't get me wrong, I still have issues in a lot of areas regarding, like confidence, or even just kind of feeling like that imposter syndrome. Like that is so inherent in almost everything I do, but I do it because I love it and I really nerd out about what I love. Even when I had my children, right, I had postpartum with both of my children to an extent where it got very dangerous, especially with my second born. And that's when I learned that that was more hormonal, and I got, help for that. Seeing that and recognizing that is the most important thing, and realizing it's okay to be different in that way, because literally we're all so different. We're all made up of different chemistry, different hormonal balances, different biology. It's so unique that you can't ever compare yourself to somebody else. And we do it naturally because that's literally our neurological makeup, trying to create connections and groupings to ensure we're with the right group, right? That's very biological and foundational to who we are. But you have to recognize that you can't do that when you're going through your own stuff. And that's kind of how I've been able to keep myself going forward. It helps to have a mission in life. And that mission for me is my family and my children, and also just trying to make work suck less for most people. That's kind of like my personal mission. And that keeps me going. And that's kind of how I've been able to pull myself out repeatedly in these darker crevices. But, the journey is never, that kind of exponential growth. It's very like ups and downs, hills and valleys. But the overall trajectory, if you do span out, looks like that, right? And so that's been kind of my ups and downs, but my crevices versus my hills, right, have been around those diagnoses, as well as my personal past, trying to overcome that and heal from that. And I've learned that talking about it also helps to heal that, and move forward, but realizing it helps others know that what you're experiencing is not okay. You have to talk to somebody to become okay. And the first step in is recognizing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah, a little deep and dark for a moment, but we're okay.
No, that's okay, because like I say, I believe a lot of people live in that, the secret suffering, the silent suffering, right? And so to hear a true story of somebody being vulnerable and saying, hey, I was there, then somebody can say, hey, I am there, and now I've heard of something that I can do about it. It makes it a bit safer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would you tell us a little bit about the experience of the diagnosis, right? And what I'm getting at is, how do you see yourself now, knowing that you've been diagnosed? I'm going to leave it that broad, and then if we need to go deeper, we can.
I see myself more. So it's a double-edged sword, right? And it is because of how we define mental health in society. And it's still being evolved in how we define it. And so part of me sees it as a puzzle piece to myself to be more whole, and that I'm okay with that, right? It's just a part of me that makes me who I am, and I'm able to navigate it with help. The other part of me sees it as like this handicap that I have to overcome to make it that much further, right? To even just have a normal day, I have to overcome X amount of, insecurities or hurdles just to be functional. And so it's that double-edged sword where I feel comfortable with it and I'm okay with it. And going through that process helped me learn a lot about myself, as well as what I'm experiencing is actually very common. But at the same time, it's like I have to do 10 times more than what somebody who may not be experiencing that to just be at the same level as them. And I'm also more open about it with like friends and family, because I'm not afraid to say that I'll get drained further, or I'm not going to be able to encompass as much excitement for something, or I can't check in as often because I need that time for me, and I need that for my own sanity, right? So it gives me a good way to set boundaries. But again, it's that learning about that. So it's that puzzle piece that I've been missing that makes me complete and who I am. But it also is a reminder of the more challenges that I'll need to continue to overcome to be at that level as everyone else.
Mm-hmm. So tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like, let me rephrase this in a way that by the way you're talking, I can tell that you don't see yourself as broken because of this diagnosis. Am I right in that?
Yes, in a sense, yes.
Okay, tell me about this. You say in a sense. Tell me about that.
So it's not necessarily that I'm broken, but it's an extra layer that I have to overcome. So it doesn't break me, but it makes it where I need to work harder. So a lot of people would see that part of that definition of where I need to work harder for it, right? They might see that as broken because you have to do much more to be at a normal area. But I don't see that as that case, but I just know that that's usually how people might interpret that particular piece of it, right? It's a part of me. I'm not broken because of it, but I know the extra challenges I will incur to keep moving forward because of that. Yeah. And I know that some people might focus on that part where they're like, well, that means you're broken. It's like, no, it's not. That's not what that means. Right. So that's what that in a sense means.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah. Now, of course, I don't understand everything there is to know about mental health. Everybody has their very different experiences. But with diagnoses, I believe that, yes, sometimes they can help us understand ourselves a bit better and say, oh, my goodness, that is why this happens, or that is why I feel this way. And that can be empowering, and even, what's the word? It lifts a lot of weight off our shoulders, right?
It does. It does tremendously. And I do think that that's why it's such a hard step to take, because it's a big risk, because there's a chance that you may not have a diagnosis that comes forward that explains anything, or you may have a diagnosis that doesn't explain everything. But for me, it made a lot of sense. A lot of things clicked. Like, oh my God, I had no idea. And my doctor was like, how have you been living, honestly, like at these levels for this long and maintaining? And I thought I was just OCD, right? Like, and she's like, well, you have that too, but not to the extent that you think. And the way you're defining OCD is not really what it is, right? And I was like, oh, right. So it was nice to have an answer. And that's what I think really causes that lift. But that doesn't give you like the actual plan to move forward. It just gives you the information you need to create a plan. And so sometimes people get that answer and it's not the answer they're looking for, and it's not the right answer that they were wanting. And that's when it can get difficult. So I would say, don't look at that as being the end of the tell-all. It's the first step to start that plan, and that plan has to adjust based on that answer. And I think that will help people navigate that scenario more easily, because it's not easy to talk to somebody about it, because you do feel that, and that's social anxiety too, right? Like you don't want to, because then you feel judged and then you're worried about what they'll think. And I've learned so many times that people don't think about you as often as you think about you. You'll never be in their mindset like you think you are, right? And we don't think that way, but that's just what you have to constantly remind yourself. Like, they're not going to remember you after this time. They're a doctor. They see so many people. They probably have all similarities. They're not going to pinpoint you and judge you. Like, they're there to help you. And if a doctor doesn't want to help you, then they're not the right doctor for you. Like, you have to pick your doctor just as much as they pick their patients. Like, you can't really just go up willy-nilly about it.
Oh, that's good. I love how you said that. And it sounds like we're going on the same track here where, I've seen some people use a diagnosis as an excuse or a crutch, and then they just don't live empowered the rest of their life. They're forever labeled, right? But can you speak to that? Where, okay, I have a diagnosis, but how do I choose to live my life?
So it can, I can see exactly how it can be used as a crutch, right? Like if I'm having a really, really bad day, or if I just need to be separated from the world, I kind of do use that, right, as an excuse. It's like, I'm just dealing with a lot right now. I know that I'm dealing with these types of things in my livelihood. They're just coming to a head. Like I need this space. So I can see how some people may lean on that, but that's not what it's there for. It's a tool for you to understand you and for you to become the best version of you. And that is so cliche, and I get it, but it's true, right? Like sometimes the most cliche things are true, but they sound cliche just because you don't want to believe it. We are mentally wired on a neurological level. And I love neuroscience combined with HR stuff. So like, that's kind of my thing.
Yeah.
But we're neurologically wired to believe the negative thoughts that we have versus the positives. And that's a survival skill that we've learned when we were first starting out in the world. And so we're going to believe that for that fight or flight response. And so we have to work harder, like 10 to 20 times harder to believe a positive thing. So when you hear something cliche, is because you're neurologically saying, well, that's just too positive for me to believe. Like I can't really go towards that direction. But you got to keep repeating it in order to keep going in that direction, because to be the best version of yourself, if you're not on a self-learning journey, then you'll never find out who you are. You'll never find that purpose that you want to be. And that purpose could be just truly as simple as living in the moment. Like that was that Pixar movie Soul, right? That was that learning moment for them of like, that was their purpose. It's just to live in the moment. You don't have to have some grander purpose in life. And I think as younger generations come into play, that's the kind of mentality that they're thinking. Like, I need to have this grand purpose because we have influencers and movie stars and politicians, but you don't have to have that to live a full life as well. Something as simple as HR, it's not a glamorous job. And you're often never given the credit that's due because you're behind the scenes working the stage, right? That's what your job is. But it's still meaningful and it's purposeful. And so you got to go on that self-learning journey to understand that. And part of that diagnosis is part of that journey. And so when you use it as a crutch and you use it as an excuse, you're just trying to not, like you're either in a very dark situation much more than you originally thought that you have to pull yourself out of in order to continue forward in your journey, or you're using it as an excuse to definitively not move forward because you are too scared to find out who you are with this new piece of you. And that's also a survival mechanism where you just don't want to go towards that because it could be new to you. And that's not something that you're neurologically and biologically wired to go for. So It's just one of those things where I see it used as a crutch. I understand as to why, but that's only hurting you. And that's literally your biological response to something new. But you have to use it as a stepping stone towards that future in order to facilitate finding out who you are and actually creating that best version of you to live that more meaningful and purposeful life, whatever that may look like for you.
Well said.
Got really philosophical.
No, I love it. And that's exactly right. Because whatever we call it, whether it's a diagnosis, whether it's a trauma, whether it's something that happened years ago, whether it's I hate my boss, my work sucks, whatever, we all have some element of life that if we allow it can become an excuse and a crutch, right? Well, I can't because. And if we live that way, then it's just not a very great way to live. Now, Of course, if those things existed, then we don't say, well, let me just try to forget about them because that's not healthy. But we learn about them, we validate them, and we do all that we can to release the hurt from the past so that we can move on to the future. Now, the hurt from the past can be something that allows us to relate with others, right? Because, hey, I've experienced something too. That means we're both human, we're both imperfect, we both have struggles. Great. Let's talk about something. And then we can strengthen one another. Awesome. But the thing is, so many of us live behind our labels, behind our excuses, behind our, well, I'm the only one who feels this way. And then that destroys the connection.
Mhm.
And with no connection, there's not a lot of joy, right? We're not
Yeah.
meant to live alone.
It's tough in that regard, right? So again, that's that expectation that's put on you. That's that example that you got to be seen as, your parents living a certain way. It's very much a societal thing. And the more we create a normacy around mental health or exploring different things, or, female on male abusive relationships, that's very seen as not normal, but it is normal. It happens more than we want to recognize, but it's taboo to talk about versus male on female abuse. Like, it's one of those things where the more as a society we create the normacy and what's considered normal, the more you'll see that authentic self come to fruition and those connections remain. But we live in such a place right now where your image matters, your personal brand matters. You saw your parents never struggle really, right? Or you did, and you don't want to ever showcase that. Or you never got to see that example set of like what is healthy to talk through or what is considered normal from a parental perspective. So you're, educationally raising in an area where it's like, well, I can't show that kind of weakness. Like, that's a common societal misconception for men, right? Like, they're not allowed to show emotion. And that's a very, volatile subject in a lot of things when it comes to raising your children. Like, do you let boys cry? Do you not? Right? It's normal to cry. We get it. But like, there's that societal norm of like, boys don't cry. Well, if you raise somebody in that way, that's a really bad, example that they're going to set moving forward, and it's just perpetuating. So it's a catch-22. It's like, it's such a huge systematic change that needs to occur in order to create that connection piece and that authentic piece on all levels, social media, whatever you want to call it, work, who we show up at work as, who we show up at home as, right? To where that can just all be one person. But we don't have that happening at that kind of major shift level to facilitate this. So it's happening at smaller levels and smaller little pieces of like, we're talking more about mental health. It's becoming a normal thing to talk about. So there's less, push back to not talk about it than before. So more people are going to come forward and talk about that. So the more we create normacy around all the different facets of your personal life, your mental health, etc., the more it will become societal norm and less taboo, and create that connection piece long term, because it's just who we are. Because I believe it was a Japanese proverb, or maybe Chinese, where it's like you have three selves, right? You have who you show up as around people, who you show up as for yourself, and then your true self. And it's like, well, technically those should be all one person. The problem is society has made it to where you have to be three different people. And we need to create that where you come back to as a whole, so you can truly create those connections on an authentic level that's deeper than just a social connection type scenario. Does that make sense?
Well, it totally does. And yeah, it goes right into what I was going to ask, because I love what you're talking about. And I know I kind of reversed this in an order of a podcast where we get to know you a bit and then we go deep, but we went deep and now we're going to get to know you. But that's okay.
That's okay.
Because here's the interesting thing, and I don't want to categorize this too much, but for the sake of the conversation, I am, where you are a public speaker, you're an entrepreneur, you're in HR, and you have a master's degree in what?
Employment and labor law.
There we go. So these aspects where talking about the three selves, right? A lot of people, especially just looking at a LinkedIn or in the world of work, we say, what are your titles? And that's the self that you have to show up as. Mm-hmm. Maybe through a water cooler discussion or through a personal conversation that happens at the end of the day, maybe we'll get to know you as a person, a person behind the title. But how often do we actually get to know the human being that exists, right? And all your experiences that we can relate with. I don't have your same titles. I don't have your same life experiences, but I definitely relate on emotional things that we've experienced. Mm-hmm. And that creates some strong connections and says, wow, I'm not alone. I can work through this. Let's talk through these things. And sure, there's still an element of It's not so comfortable because I don't want to admit that I feel this, or I don't want to remember that I felt this. But like you said, when you're able to talk about it with your family and friends in the proper way, of course,
Mhm.
then you feel liberated. You feel like the weight is lifted off, correct?
Yeah, it's like shedding that outer layer of skin, right? Like that's really, you're becoming more of your whole self versus
Mm-hmm.
I have to be one of these three faces. And for me, showing up at work, I've learned over the course of my career that, I started out in a very large Fortune 500 company, and I've worked my way more into smaller companies, and I've consulted with smaller and larger companies. And I've worked with companies as small as 3 people and as large as 15,000, right? So for me, as I've gone more deeper in my career and kind of my different areas of expertise, I've learned the more I show up as myself, the more I'm capable of making the impact that I'm looking to make. And they're not every single job allows for that. And that's made by design based on a very fundamental scientific method that was created for the Industrial Revolution, right? That is literally created so that the human being is not involved, because that's what needs to happen for productivity. But that's not the world we live in now. And so we're at this climax of these two different environments. And I feel like COVID has only exponentially showcased this climax of, I'm a human being, I want to show up for work, and there are companies who are doing that. And I'm a company that needs no human to really necessarily show up because of productivity and based on a scientific mythology that was created for the Industrial Revolution, and create kind of this, cross of effect. And so we're seeing this great resignation and this labor shortage, et cetera. But it's like, I haven't seen that in some of the companies that I work with. I actually have really strong retention, and over 70% of our hires are referrals, because we've created environments where somebody can actually be who they are. There's structure to that, right? Like there's certain things that are acceptable and certain things that aren't. But at the same time, you're a functioning adult that can operate in society, like operate within that structure in a way that you can still come as you, and you see a lot better success there. But that's not how work was designed, but people are starting to see that and they want that. And that's kind of where we're at right now with this whole climax of this work environment. And nobody really wants to talk about that, because it's us versus them, big business versus the individual. And again, unless something climactic happens at a major shift, kind of like everybody not showing up to work, the businesses will never care because they care about the profit. That's not for all businesses. There's quite a few businesses that do care and actually make an effort, but for the greater sense of everything. And that's just, again, a societal norm that's not talked about, that's not, brought up, because it's the way it's always been. And we like to side with comfort and what we know versus what we don't know. And there's a lot of other extra layers in there that I'm probably not even qualified to even comprehend, right? So it's just one of those things where you have to shed those layers. You have to show up as yourself. And that's really hard to do. But when you can create that, and when you can experience that, it's a whole nother way of working and being who you are. And it's no longer that you're your job. It's that you get to do your job as you. And then those titles don't matter. Like my social network titles, all those titles are just titles that have happened, right? I've literally scaled entire companies 4 times over. I've built structures. I've been basically a CHRO of a lot of different roles, but my title has always been HR manager, because that's what makes sense for that structure, right? I could have somebody who says they're a VP of customer experience, and all they're doing is maybe chatting customer service. Like those things don't mean anything. What makes meaning is you and what you're bringing to work and how you're performing and living that life. And the titles are great, but that's not for you. That's for everyone else. And so if that's something you need to validate yourself, then that means that you're still learning about yourself, and that you need to continue to learn about yourself and what matters to you, because that matters to some people. And that's great. Maybe you're very ambitious. That means that you just got to keep learning about yourself to understand how you can get to those roles in your reality, right? But maybe you learn those don't matter. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't matter to somebody else, but I honor that for me and I honor that for them. And I'm going to acknowledge that when I'm interacting with them on LinkedIn, et cetera. Like, it's just another piece of the puzzle that can be very differently defined for each individual. And in my personal journey, those things don't matter because it's what you bring to the table and it's how you bring it to the table that makes a difference. And that's not necessarily tied to a title. And that kind of brings me back to like why I like that talent innovator title, right? Because I feel like that's a lot more encompassing of what I try to do and what I try to impact versus like an HR manager, you know, like it's just a very different meaning and a very different thing that I bring to the table when I'm working with companies. And it definitely, I think, showcases in the impact that I'm able to have. And I have an impact because I'm able to bring, you know, myself and all of my awkwardness and into the game as well. But that helps me deliver that message and that impact all the greater. I just went on a really long tangent. I'm so sorry.
No worries. I'm going to say, wow, definitely a public speaker. You know how to phrase and bring these things to light. So good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Man, and usually I'm pretty good at summarizing and pulling out the nuggets, but you just did a great job. So what I'll say is what I've been learning, especially recently about this mental health in general, is if we don't learn about ourselves, like you've been saying, and come to understand ourselves in a way that we say, okay, even though this happened, or even though this is a part of me, I still can do something, then we often hide a part of ourselves because we're ashamed of it, right? Well, I can't let anybody know because I don't understand it, or I hate it, or I feel terrible about it, or whatever. And that stops us from bringing our true self to work or to life or to a relationship or whatever we're talking about. And then, yes, we have to be validated by an outside source or a title or a recognition or a salary or something, right? I think that's huge. So I'm really glad we brought that up. Now let's just hone it in to HR specifically for a second, where talking about societal norms, it's often, even though it might be unspoken, right? But it's just the invisible culture that we kind of feel that us in HR, since we develop policies and since we have to help everybody keep the rules and we have to be very politically correct or whatever we want to call it, then we think, okay, I'm so busy taking care of everybody else and making sure that they're following the rules that I don't have time to take care of myself. Or I can't tell anybody that I'm struggling because then how am I supposed to uphold everything else that I'm working on? So what would be your piece of advice to an HR professional who might be in this situation?
It's so funny because I was very much in that, you know, starting out, right? I would, and this is something that I talk about in some of my conversations at conferences. It's, you have to treat it like you're taking care of everyone else when you take care of yourself. So very much when, and I know that it's easy for me to like use a metaphor about a mom, right? Because, you know, I am a mom as well as there's a lot of moms out there, but there's also a lot of dads out there too, right? And even people who don't have children, like if you don't take care of yourself and something happens to you, then for example, in the mom case, then your children have no one, right? There's something that's missing that they are no longer capable of being taken care of. And they're in a situation where they don't know how to self-sustain. So kind of bringing that metaphor back into the HR realm. If you view taking care of yourself as though you are taking care of everyone else, that helps to bring that level of guilt down, right? Because if something happens to you and there's no other HR, I tend to focus a lot on HR departments of one because that tends to be what my specialty is. So there is no one else most of the time. Then everyone else is left dry. They're left hanging and they've never been able to learn how to self-sustain, right? Because you've never let them learn. You've always taken care of everyone else. So it's about kind of raising your company in a way that you would an animal or a child or even a plant, right? Like there are times when you take care of it, but the times that you don't have to take care of it, you take care of yourself. And during those times, they're able to pick up bits and pieces of self-sustaining skill sets to facilitate this nice blend or this nice cohesiveness where you're now yin and yang, right? Like if you go on vacation, not everything is going to crumble. Or if you take a mental day off, not everything is going to fall apart. And it's about starting small with those types of steps that can help to facilitate maybe taking off a whole week for a vacation. If you have a full HR department, that's even more of an excuse to warrant self-care, right? Because then it's like, yes, you have this niche part that's important as a part of the whole picture. So, but they're not going to collapse without you. Like they can still survive. And it's up to your manager then or your leader when you have a department to ensure the mental health of everyone else. That is your job. If you have a major project coming up, make sure to schedule breaks in. I had one person come to me after seeing me speak, ask about that very scenario. And I said, schedule on a rotational schedule, all your recruiters a day off. That doesn't count towards PTO. And every other Friday or however you want to do that, they have a day off. You don't need to tell it to the whole company. But if you're going to scale like 500 positions and all your recruiters you're going to be doing is being on the phone constantly and dealing with all these things, they're going to burn out. You need to facilitate breaks for them to be okay. And as a leader, that's what you're supposed to do. And if you're a department of one, you have to set that example for your other managers and your leaders. So by taking care of yourself, view it as a step of taking care of everyone else, because without you, there's a piece of that puzzle that's not complete, and then that can crumble or ruin that whole design and of that picture, right? Like the puzzle piece is a very fun metaphoric picture for us to follow. And so you just have to make sure that you're capable of being plugged in as needed. And you cannot do that unless you take care of yourself, because it is not a fun picture to get to a point where you have that breakdown. I've been there. That's kind of how I learned to first go towards self-care and like my diagnosis steps, right? But it's not a fun picture to get to, even in a young profession or in an older, more experienced professional setting. So just view it as a step of taking care of everyone else. And I feel like that can help facilitate more HR professionals to take their self-care a little bit more seriously and set it as like an appointment or a reminder as you would anyone else, and hold it sacred and say like, I'm going to go for a walk at these times during the day, or I'm going to take every third Friday off, or whatever that might look like for them that makes them feel more connected to what they're doing.
Awesome. I love how you worded that. Just see taking care of yourself as part of taking care of everybody else. That's well said. Well, thank you again, Kelly. This has been a great discussion, and I do hope we stay in touch.
Absolutely, Ben. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. We'll see you.
Thanks. Bye.